One of the protective devices that trauma survivors use that we haven't discussed much is disassociation. A simple but I think effective definition of disassociation is cutting off parts of the self that hold the trauma-related emotions and memories and putting them into exile. Then we build layers of protection around them so that no one, and sometimes not even ourselves or the trauma survivor, has access to those parts that hold the trauma. So this is different than, say, repression, which Freud talked a lot about, which is what they call a more horizontal split from conscious to the unconscious. Disassociation is what we call a vertical split, where there's a part of us, a part of our personality, a part that holds the trauma and the pain associated with that, gets sort of split off from the self and gets put into exile. And this is actually a very creative way that the mind uses to protect itself. If something is overwhelming and is happening and there is no escape, then one of the best ways to deal with it is to not be there, mentally and emotionally. It's actually a brilliant way of dealing with trauma. And it's what we're going to talk about today, trauma's dilemma, finding your way back from disassociation. Welcome to Trauma-Free Relationship. I'm Tom Philp, your host. And as a therapist, I've spent over 10,000 hours helping couples work through their trauma so they can repair ruptures, heal their wounds, and communicate from a place of wholeness and connection. Let's get started. When we encounter something that is frightening, overwhelming, and our first instinct is to go to fight or flight. That is typically our first bodily autonomic response for dealing with something that's scary or frightening. And so we either gear ourselves up to fight or we engage in flight and try to escape or leave. But what if neither of those options are available? Then our next option is to freeze, to go into hypoarousal. And for more on that, you can listen to my previous episode on the window of tolerance. But basically, this is the opposite of hyperarousal, where we are flooded with anxiety. Rather, what happens is we go into more of a freeze state. And if the trauma is overwhelming enough, then we will disassociate. We will cut off a part of ourselves that's holding the trauma and put it into exile. Now, to be fair and to give a full understanding of disassociation, this is not just something that happens to us when we are traumatized. We all disassociate at times. When I'm driving to work, and when I get there, I realize that I really wasn't paying attention to driving, but I was actually thinking the whole time about my next podcast or episode and what it's going to be on. That's a form of disassociation. I was not aware of my surroundings, even though I was sort of automatically doing what I normally do every day, driving the car, taking the same route, so on and so forth. But I was off in my head someplace else. So that is a type of disassociation. Daydreaming can be a type of disassociation. And so please understand that this thing we're talking about today, it sounds really heavy, but it exists on a large spectrum. From small examples that I just gave where we might daydream or not realize that we're in the middle of doing something because we are off in our head somewhere, to the other extreme form of disassociation, which would be something like multiple personality disorders or what is now called dissociative identity disorder. So I want to put this into context and recognize this is not just something that happens in trauma, but But when we are overwhelmed and fearful and cannot escape, then the extreme form of this can take place in our mind. And as I said, it's a very creative way. It's actually a brilliant way that our mind and our body comes up with to protect ourselves. And so disassociation and its symptoms, again, exist on a spectrum. So let's dig in a little bit deeper and talk about, well, what are some of the symptoms of disassociation? How do we recognize that this is a way of coping that we might have adopted through past trauma? Well, let me run down a list of symptoms of disassociation, and some of these will apply to you and some won't. Remember, disassociation is on a large spectrum. So depending on where you fall on that spectrum, some of these will fit and some won't. I also want to reiterate that I'm not diagnosing anyone here that may be listening. I'm simply wanting us to recognize a range of symptoms that can exist on this spectrum that are associated with disassociation. So here's some of them. You may notice other changes in the way you feel, such as having an out-of-body experience. So you may begin to feel like you're not really encased in your own body. You might feel like you are a different person sometimes. You might feel like your heart is pounding or you're lightheaded. You could feel emotionally numb or detached, or you could feel little pain. Other symptoms might include having an altered sense of time, so it doesn't feel like time is tracking the same way it does for you when you are feeling connected in your body. And as I mentioned before, this can also occur when we're so engrossed in something. Again, this is sort of the normal, healthy side of disassociation. That we could lose track of time, right? There's certainly times where I have been so engrossed in a client's or couple's story that I completely lose track of time. All of a sudden, it just seems like the whole hour is up. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that went so fast, because I was so engrossed in what they were saying that I was not aware of time and space around me, so to speak. Also, not remembering how you got somewhere, as I mentioned. You can have tunnel vision. You can hear voices in your head. You can have intense flashbacks that are very real. And in fact, that is one of the symptoms of PTSD, is where you have a flashback, and it's not something that happened to you back then, but rather something that is happening to you in the here and now. Also, with disassociation, you can become immobile. And you can also get absorbed in a fantasy world that seems very real. So those are just some of the, as I said, broad symptoms. And I point these out not to diagnose anybody, but rather to help you understand, is any of this applicable to me? Is any of this something that I find that I might use when I begin feeling really stressed or when I get triggered? Now, I want to mention, typically, this list that I've just spoken about falls into one of two categories. The first one is dispersonalization, which involves a sense of separation from ourself or feeling that we're outside of ourselves. We may feel as if we're seeing our actions, feelings, thoughts, and us having a sense of self from a distance, almost like we're watching a movie. You know, this is often reported when people have near-death experiences where they feel like somehow they've floated up or outside of their body and they're watching themselves go through this sort of horrific, intense situation, whatever it might be, until all of a sudden they're sort of back in their body. And so that can be a form of disassociation. I remember when I was about, I think it was 10, 12 years old, and I was riding my bike with one of my best buddies. We had a neighborhood pool that during the summer we would ride to probably multiple times a day, jump in, cool off, get back on our bikes, ride back to our homes, continue playing whatever we were playing with. But to get to the pool, there was a very steep hill you had to go up. And it was very hard to get up the hill, but it was a blast coming back down that hill. And so there was a particular time where he and I were racing down the hill, and I was in the lead, and I was going quite fast on my bike. And I looked back to see where he was at, and then I looked forward, and I noticed a car coming up the hill. And it started to turn into its driveway on the side. And so I looked back, and when I looked around again, the car had backed back out of the driveway, when now basically was in the middle of the street. And I remember slamming on my brakes and laying down my bike on its side as I went plunging almost completely under the car, which now as an adult and I'm older, I must have scared the living daylights out of that poor driver. I feel so bad for them because they were just minding their own business, maybe didn't see us or thought they had plenty of time, who knows. But nonetheless, when this moment happened, there was what was left of my little 12 years in my life sort of flashed before my eyes, and I can remember sort of seeing myself almost from above myself. Well, I think that's a good example of how sometimes dispersonalization can occur in something that is frightening and overwhelming. And I'm not putting that experience on any level with trauma you may have had through abuse and neglect and repeated complex trauma in your life. So I don't mean to draw that comparison, but I'm just pointing out how in my own life, I can remember a time and an experience that was overwhelming that happened where I felt like I had sort of floated out of my body and I was looking at myself stuck halfway underneath this car on my bike, and then I sort of snapped back into it and was back in my body. And so that's one of the two categories. The other category is derealization, which involves the feeling that other people and things are separate from you and they seem foggy and dreamlike. As I mentioned earlier, time may seem to slow down or speed up, or somehow the world may not seem real. And so finally, these symptoms can last from a few minutes or multiple days. In the example I gave about riding my bike, it probably did not last maybe more than a few seconds, although my memory feels like it lasted a long time because time had slowed down in that moment for me. And so in that moment, I had both dispersonalization as well as derealization going on. Again, my brain was finding a creative way to protect me. There was no ability for me to fight back or to escape what was happening to me. And so it found another alternative to protect myself. And so, again, I can work with couples all the time that might have some disassociation going on within the session. And sometimes it might last for a few minutes. Other times it might help take me doing some grounding techniques with them to come back and begin to sort of feel like they're back in their body, feel like they're back in the room with us. So a variety of techniques, and we'll get to those here in just a moment. But all those things can play out when we're feeling disassociated. Again, I really want to normalize this because what I think is so important is not some sort of clinical syndrome of or clusters of symptoms that say, oh, yes, you can disassociate. What's important is that this is your mind's way of protecting itself. And if I don't offer enough encouragement on this channel to anybody that's listening and struggling with trauma in their relationships, you blanking out or feeling numb or feeling like time is slowing down when you begin to get stress or when you get caught in those negative cycles with your partner, it is normal. It is okay. It is your body and brain's way of protecting you. Now, it can act as a double-edged sword because it does have an effect on the relationship. So it is yours to own and take responsibility for and work on, but it is not yours to judge or criticize or to criticize yourself for having it. That to me is a very important distinction. Understanding what's happening to you and why it's happening and making a plan to work on it is one thing. Blaming yourself or blaming or thinking that you're broken, going back to those negative core beliefs that you hold with that is not okay, because it's not your fault. It's not your fault that this is how you're coping with stress in your relationship. So I just want to make that clear and make that distinction. Let's talk for a few minutes about, if we do recognize we're disassociating, then what can we do to help ourselves in those moments? Well, as the title suggests, how do we find our way back if we are disassociating? We've got to get back into space and time. We've got to get back into our body. We've got to get back into a regulated state so that we are not so frozen. Well, one of the first things I'll tell you is, in the moment, if you are capable, then some grounding techniques are very important. So breathing slowly while counting and focusing on your breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth, breathing from your diaphragm, not your chest, taking some deep cleansing breaths. That can help ground you and bring you back to you, back to your sense of self. Tuning into different sounds around you. Can you pay attention to the chirping birds outside? Can you pay attention to the air conditioning humming in the background? Anything like that can sort of snap you back into your sense of self. Walking barefoot and noticing how the ground feels, or wrapping a blanket around you and noticing how it feels around your body. Holding an ice cube or splashing cold water on your face, or touching something with an interesting texture, such as your pant leg. If you're wearing, maybe corduroy pants, how do the corduroys feel against your hands? How does it feel when your hands rub your legs against the corduroy? Or sniffing a strong smell of some kind. These are all grounding techniques that can help you sort of come back to and orient yourself to the current place and time of where you are. And so I would encourage you to pick a couple of 2 or 3 of these and just use them enough so that you have them in your toolbox. And if you find that you start getting stressed, and one of the ways your brain starts to cope with that is to disassociate, you can use these tools to sort of bring yourself back and orient yourself to the here and now. Finally, I would say visualization is really important. So it might help to put yourself in a safe place. It might help to imagine a loving figure, a strong attachment, secure attachment figure in your life, not an insecure figure. Don't choose somebody that you have frequent ruptures and little repairs with. Don't choose somebody who's caused you trauma in the past. Choose somebody that has always sort of had a gleam in their eye when they saw you. Maybe that's a grandparent. Maybe that's a sibling. Maybe that's a teacher. But who in your life has lit up with joy when they see you, makes you feel special, makes you feel loved, has always been in your corner and championed you? That's somebody that you want to visualize. Visualize them wrapping you in a big hug, whispering in your ear, it's going to be okay. You're going to be all right. I'm here with you. So that's another thing I think is important, is to visualize when you start feeling anxious and when you start getting stressed, then try to visualize a safe place or someone that you can be safe with. And then some other things that I think I would be remiss not to mention would be to try to limit stress in your life. So I know that's not possible to do 100%, but what are little ways, little things you can do in your life that might just take down the stress level a notch or 2? Also remember, eating healthy, staying away from drugs and alcohol, and exercise are really important. A brisk 20-minute walk around your neighborhood or even around your house or somewhere around a park, somewhere safe, can have wonderful benefits on your mind-body connection. So exercise can also create more capacity to handle stress in your life because you're getting out some of that stress through your body. So being able to do at least those three things, limit stress, eat healthy, and exercise, and stay away from excessive drugs and alcohol, that can help your stress levels as well. Finally, let me just say that if you find that you're really struggling with this, reach out to a local mental health professional. Find a therapist near you because you need help with this. And there's no shame in asking for help because this happens to be one of the ways, or the only way maybe, that your body was able to deal with your trauma. So be sure and reach out. Find somebody near you that knows how to treat trauma, that's been trained in trauma, and that will really be able to help you, because that would be very important to feel like you're being proactive and to give yourself a sense of power as you begin to overcome this very powerful coping mechanism. Well, thank you very much for listening. As always, it's an absolute pleasure to get feedback from everybody. Thank you so much for letting us know what you like and what you don't like. Continue to reach out. And as always, we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to Trauma-Free Relationship, a podcast for the healing of attachment trauma. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or our website at traumafreerelationship.com. Be sure to look for our next episode on your favorite streaming service.